If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. I want to begin by expressing my sympathy to you and other folks who are likely struggling with what I call productivity anxiety. I'm sympathetic and empathetic because I dealt with a good bit of this around 2009, 2010, a little bit into 2011. And that pain resulted in the energy to build the processes that you may now know as attention compass. I will say that the struggle with productivity anxiety is challenging. And our society has been struggling over a long period of time to capture the moment that we're facing and put it into words. So my goal today is to provide an analysis of the underlying causes and symptoms of this pervasive problem and to shift the rhetoric away from self-blame or some syndrome over to technique. And we're here to talk about a fundamental solution for this productivity anxiety and the techniques that's around cognitive ergonomics. Now, that's a lot to say at once, but that's what I've come to call the solution to this. So ergonomics is the study of humans in the workplace. And as we're increasingly knowledge workers, then we're using our cognition. So I think of this solution as ergonomics for our cognitive processes. I suggest that this topic holds immense value for you because we're facing a situation where 80% of workers report experiencing productivity anxiety. This is not merely an emotional issue. The environment around us is actively hampering the very thing that we're trying to do. The thing we're trying to do is think. In fact, there's some data that suggests that our collective IQ may actually be going down. And that's a challenge because we're talking about cognition. And that's an environmental result, I think. Now, by focusing on technique, on how we manage our attention, we can build systems that support us and prevent the decline of strong cognition and thus enhance overall life performance, satisfaction, what I've come to call flourishing. So you probably know that I have this training and I offer it to people, and it's on how to manage your attention. So I teach workflows and tools. I teach everyday practices in your work and in your life that resolve much of the problem of productivity anxiety. And again, I'm coming to use the term cognitive ergonomics. If that's something you'd like to talk about or are interested in, I'd love to have a conversation with you. Hit me at larry@dobusyright.com or catch me on LinkedIn. So let's talk about this productivity anxiety and how it combats with our cognitive abilities. So first, some symptoms. So I would suggest that the stress that we're feeling really causes a lack of nuanced thought. And this leads in other settings to problems like all or nothing thinking, to self-judgment and catastrophizing in our minds. Okay. And productivity, we've got metaphors for it, right? I'm drowning in email, right? I'm caught on a hamster wheel, constantly going faster but never getting anywhere against an incoming tide of claims on my attention. The treadmill, the I Love Lucy episode where they're in the chocolate factory and she winds up eating chocolates because she can't wrap them fast enough. All of these metaphors and mental images are what we're talking about and what we literally feel when we try to assess what's going on with our incoming information and thus our attention. So when we talk about anxiety, of course, we all know what anxiety feels like, and it's very much emotionally driven. It's a natural response when we're faced with situations that we don't feel we can exert sufficient control over. And the root word literally means choking. The Greek word derives from a word that means choking. And that's, again, not a terrible metaphor. for what we face in the modern culture generally, and then specifically in the knowledge work culture that we face today. And one of the challenges is under stress and time pressure, which is time pressure is a different variety of stress. We naturally respond emotionally rather than thinking things through carefully and rationally, at least most of us. Now, some of us out there, first responders, et cetera, have, I'll use the word, been trained to manage this. As likely as not, they've just been in it enough that they've learned to deal with it, because training is really hard to come by around this. Now, when we look at this situation, right, at this productivity anxiety, this impacts our cognition. It impacts our very ability to do the things that are going to help us get out of it. Unfortunately, it also influences our self-perception, particularly in the modern culture. So the environment that we're faced really hampers any kind of cognitive work that we try to do. Because in cognitive work, we need to be thoughtful. In knowledge work, we need to think about things. Our brain is our productive asset. And we need to shift into more prefrontal cortex kind of thinking, where stress and anxiety tend to push us back and down in our brain towards the amygdala and the fear centers and those sorts of things that go on. And we respond from that rather than responding from our logic and our humanity. Now, this is, in my view, overwhelmingly an environmental problem and not a personal weakness. And I'm going to try and show you some evidence for why I believe that to be true. And this is important because it's typically labeled as deficit syndrome. Okay, these medical sounding terms, psychological sounding terms that really are very akin to, oh, you have a disease, you have a syndrome, right? You have, some situation that is in you, in your brain, in your body, that you're more or less born with. And I argue against that. I don't get into the debate. I'm not that kind of a doctor, but I do think that most people, given the correct tools and the correct workflows, will find that this stress and anxiety reduces dramatically. But before we can do that, we're under this strain, and that's what causes us to take on these workflows and things. And that strain leads to negative outcomes. I mean, chronic dissatisfaction with ourselves, with our environment, with our situation. Okay. Discontent with ourselves and our ability to handle things. And that's not good for the kind of work that we need to be doing, the kind of work that's valuable in our economy right now. In addition, we feel inadequate. We feel like I must be somehow behind the curve. I was behind the door when that got handed out. I'm missing something. And this is a very human problem. I've seen enough people to know that it has to do with our brains and how they work. And I'll talk about that as we go forward. And like with many things in our modern society, this feeling just is compounded and increases when we perceive that other people don't appear to be suffering to the same degree. Again, in the comparison, that leads us to guilt, shame, right? Why can't I get this? I must be negative word X here. I must be broken. I must be. But I'm going to suggest to you that the problem is much more widespread than people are willing to admit. That is, people are usually very good at masking their emotions around these issues, about playing it cool, stiff upper lip, all this sort of thing. Okay. But I guarantee you there's a ton of people who are feeling this deep down inside of them, and they bite it back. And in terms of humanness, okay? When we're under this kind of stress, and particularly under cognitive stress, right, we lose nuance in our thinking. We lose nuance in our communication and in our speech. Okay, we lean towards staccato, dogmatic statements. We lead towards catastrophizing and overgeneralization. Okay, now if you're looking at this, it's something is going on in the modern communication space. Okay, the divisiveness that everybody calls out is this lack of nuance. It's a missing willingness to see any sort of benefit in the other. It's too deep to get into here. Cal Newport's doing a great job with some of that stuff over on his podcast. And I may do one here before too long, as soon as I've collected up some more information about how it works. But anyway, the point is, we lose that. And it turns us into the kinds of people that I think at our core, we don't really want to be. It tends to, okay? So external pressures, we hear a lot of this urgency, a lot of this drama in the information that we consume, right? Driven by demagogues and their, perceived urgency, right? The perceived enormity of the issue. And, that removes nuance for the sake of speed and the sake of, I don't know what the word is, drama, okay? And those things reduce our agency. And when our agency is reduced, then we feel threat and we become, our agency is what makes us human. And when it's diminished, we feel that in at least quasi-physical ways. So let's get to the causes of this situation. All right. And I'm going to say the causes are about this collision of technology and culture with human nature and the way our brains work. Okay. That's why I say the problem is environmental. So what we're feeling is a natural outgrowth of the technologies we've developed. And then we mush that together with the prevalent workplace culture, and we get this time pressure overload situation that's going on. Okay. But it's the environment that does this to us. Right. And I'm going to say, when we look at technology, it's this convenience technology, right? Our technology over at least the last couple of decades has not really given us new capabilities as much as it's just allowed us to go faster and faster and faster. And I've talked about this at great length in other episodes, but that makes us feel like we should be able to go faster than we need to and or than we're able to. Okay. And what's actually happened is that information is moving more quickly than it ever has in human existence. And that's part of the problem. It's a good thing in many ways, but it's also part of the problem, that speed. Okay. Now, the other thing is this prevailing hustle culture is what I call it. And I've talked about it in other episodes as well. And this is the work thing where it's like, I'm going to give 110%. Okay. There's a commercial that talks about we're the strivers, we're the up all nighters. And our work culture in particular, but our general culture really lionizes that kind of thinking. It makes it into heroic kind of thinking. Maybe heroes are called on to do it, but heroes aren't heroes, 5 days a week in their offices. Okay. And I think we're kind of in some ways drawn to that, but that's a fairly new set of thinking in human culture. Now, I will talk about, to some degree, the misalignment that we face between technology and cognition. Okay, as I alluded to a minute ago, almost all of our modern technology is concerned with convenience, which translates to speed. And when we look at that, we see, okay, well, information travels faster than it ever has before. Okay. And there's more people producing more information than ever before. Okay. I mean, there's plenty of stats about this, when email technology is applied to certain situations, we start using email technology to create communication paths that weren't necessary before, and frankly, are probably not necessary now. And this just increases the amount of information that's flowing back and forth. It's too much to get into right now, and there's probably another podcast on it forthcoming. But that's what's happening, is we're speeding everything up, and human beings cannot be overclocked. I've said that before in other podcasts. So the technology seems to be, and I'm a technologist by training, by career, and by study. And the technology is primarily concerned with convenience and speed, and it doesn't seem to be supporting strong cognition. Our technology is not really producing thought tools for us. It has in the distant past, and I hope it will again in the future. But right now, thought tools are scarce, and communication tools are predominant. Okay. And faster communication in and of itself is not equivalent to better quality work or higher volume work. Neither one. And that's what we seem to be getting, is faster communication and more of it. Frankly, when we look at this situation, our current technology culture is probably just making us stupid. And I say that because we see for years and years, there has been, well, decades and decades, there has been a general increase in the IQ of people in the West. And what they do is they re-baseline the test every so often, so the average is 0. Well, for the past 15 years, we have data that's showing that the IQ is actually declining against that standard. And it's not dramatic, but it does correspond with the unleashing of these technologies on an unsuspecting general public. Okay. Correlation is not causation. I understand that, but it is evidence. And so I think we probably need to take that seriously. So one of the biggest problems here is the load of non-actionable information, right? So when we look, if you look at the information that you receive on a daily basis, and this is a combination of all the different inputs that you're taking in on a daily basis, and you think of how much of it is directly actionable by you. And I think you'll be shocked to see the really small percentage of the information you receive is actually actionable. I just saw another tip on LinkedIn today that was talking about somebody else who has come up with a email categorization scheme, and it has to do with whether they're on the to line of the email, whether it's addressed to them. And in other situations, I've heard, well, I'm going to mark it as I need to deal with it if and only if I'm the only name on the to line. And there's all kinds of rules about this. And so people apply these rules to take the non-actionable information and shove it to one side. Well, that's fine, but in order to understand the nuance of modern communication, you can't use simple rules. Maybe they're successful, maybe they're not, I don't know, but simple rules simply don't work. So we've got all of this non-actionable information. And so we're in this place where the exact same cognitive asset that we use for productive output as knowledge workers is the same asset that we use to deal with information, and I mean all information. Okay, our brains expect information to be actionable according to evolutionary psychology, because the ratio of actionable to inactionable information for our ancestors was tiny. Okay, there's very little information that was not actionable, and it was all environmental in nature. And so their brains built to seek information. Okay, again, this is evolutionary psychology. Okay, For those of you that don't know, I'm a Christian, and for those of you that do know, I'm still a Christian. So, but evolutionary psychology says we didn't have to deal with this huge load of extraneous information. So our brains are not built that way. Okay. And we know this. We've studied the situation. People are driven to gather information far beyond what's useful for them. And it's been shown that if left to their own devices, people will gather so much information that it negatively influences their decision-making capabilities. This is work in behavioral economics that'll show that people do this. And it's just human nature. And so we just are inundated with information that's not actionable to us. Okay. Examples, national news. Okay. Distant tragedies in the world. And all we can do about that is worry. It's not actionable, or we can make trivial gestures in the direction, and we're used to information being actionable. Okay. So another part of the situation is that historically information moves slowly. Information moved at human speed up until the railroad and telegraph. Okay. There were outposts of faster than human speed communication. The Pony Express was not at human speed, it was at horse speed. Okay, but it was fabulously expensive and woefully slow by modern standards. Okay. So what happened, information had to speed up in order to keep up with our technology. If the fastest way information can travel is by train, then how are you going to tell the arrival station that the train's going to be late? And so then we got serious about inventing faster communication, and the telegraph was born, which communicates at the speed of electromagnetic waves, okay, which is really fast. And so we got a form of communication that could outrace the trains. Now, it wasn't a great form. It was the first form. It was cumbersome. It was encoded. It was low bandwidth. And so now we've just kept making this better and better and better. And now our channels can carry a lot more information density at that same speed. And so the speed and quantity of the information is simply beyond, in my opinion, our mental ability to react to it effectively. So when we look at this situation, right, the way information is broadcast, and I don't just mean television and radio, I mean broadcast. Actually, television is a fairly slow mode of information transmission because it operates at the speed of typically human voice. And our modern communication systems are much beyond that. So the claims that we get are urgent and emotional, but they're not actionable. Okay. I live in Tuscaloosa County in Alabama, and I get Amber Alerts from counties, 200 miles away. And what am I supposed to do? But they show up and they're urgent and there's some child involved, but it's not actionable, okay, for me. And then we talk about the workplace culture and the demands, right? The culture sort of presumes that some stressors make us more productive. But that's only potentially true from a baseline where there is very, very low stress to begin with. And the logic is about, if you have everything you need, you won't be motivated to do anything. Well, maybe, but we neither have everything we need, nor are we in a stress-free environment. And so this notion that environmental stress is good for us is opposite reality. And then workplace culture is very performance oriented, and it's very corrective. It's very top down still. We do a lot of goal setting in the workplace. Now, you don't hear me talk about goals. I think I did a podcast a while back. I don't think goals are the right way to go through life. I've looked at the science, okay? And the science is not as strong as people claim it is, in my opinion. So, the workplace culture, the cultural phenomenon, right? It also discourages contentment. even so far as framing contentment as a weakness. And so all of this around the workplace and the culture around work. And so you see, when we look at these things, right? In the environment, technology is misaligned with our cognition. We're inundated with non-actionable information. And then in the workplace culture, we're manipulated by stress to do the work that other people want us to do. So we have this this stress in our lives, right? Now, when we look at this situation, it's unlikely that we're going to be able to change the environment in meaningful ways. Moves towards the 32-hour work week, right? My joke for the longest has been, the American vacation system I refer to as the 60-0-60 vacation. Okay. And the underlying problem is they're perfectly happy for you to not be at work, but they don't have anybody to do your stuff for you while you're gone. So they'll pile it up on the corner of your desk and wait for you to bring it back, to get back to take care of it. Okay. That's because you have to work 60 hours a week before, and then you can take off a week and you have to work 60 hours when you come back. And everybody knows it. Everybody dreads the Monday after a vacation because they know what their inbox is going to look like. Okay. So that's the whole kind of piece there in a nutshell. So I'll say my solution to this is our techniques and our thinking around cognitive ergonomics. Okay. So the situation is we're using our cognition to be productive, and our cognition is under assault by our particularly communication technologies. And so we're at a place now where it's actually hurting us, and that competing calls on our attention causes stress. So we need technique. And nobody's teaching us how to manage in this new environment. There's tips and tricks floating around. Nobody teaches us how to do it. Okay. Nobody teaches us how to use technologies, how to integrate technologies with each other. Everybody will teach you how to send an email, but very few people will talk to you about how to manage email once it's sent or received. And we just don't talk about it. It may be because people don't have technique. It may be because people don't think we need technique, but nobody's talking about it. So the solution is not to, throw our hands up about this, but to focus on finding and implementing good techniques to help us through this environment. I would say, when you get over into anxiety, you start getting over into therapy, psychology, these kinds of areas. And I would say that's not going to change the environment. Okay. If therapy is a thing for you, then congratulations. You found something that helps. I've never looked into the situation, but how I feel about it has almost nothing to do with its reality, right? Nevertheless, I know people get good results from that. So it's got then to be technique in the workplace. And that's why I've come to think of it as cognitive ergonomics. Ergonomics is all about how we do work so we don't hurt ourselves. And to a lesser degree, it's how do we do work so that we can do it efficiently. Okay. And it all grew out of Henry Taylor's work in the first part of the 1900s. Okay. So technique is critical. Okay. And we have an analogy, right? Because as we moved out of agriculture and heavy, physically demanding work more into office kind of work, then culturally we adjusted by convincing each other that exercise and going to the gym was a good thing. Okay. Well, it took a while for personal trainers and Crunch Fitness or whoever it is in your neck of the woods to show up with solutions for us and help us figure out how to get in how to get in some steps so that our bodies don't atrophy. Well, the same thing is true here, right? The environment changed for us physically and we adapted to it. We adapted technique, developed technique. I mean, if you'd asked my granddad about going to a gym, he looked at you like you were insane. He didn't have the time or the energy when he got back from the steel mill to go and work out. He didn't need to. He had worked out all day long. Okay. So we're in a similar situation. Okay. Now I will say, fortunately, I firmly believe, and I've got evidence, that this is a case where we can apply technology to overcome the weaknesses of technology. And I hear from a lot of people, it's like, hey, Larry, my computer tools are the problem. Okay, don't give me another computer tool. But it's a different kind of tool. Okay, it's a meta tool. It's a tool that helps us do our work in cognitively ergonomic ways so that we don't injure ourselves, right? Mentally trying to do that. So this is the cognitive ergonomics or mental ergonomics, or maybe even attention ergonomics. And it's about identifying and managing how we respond to these environmental factors, particularly in our work, that cause us stress. Typically ergonomics is physical, and it causes our body stress in ways that damage it in the long term. Well, we're in that same situation cognitively or mentally in our workplace environment now. And what we need to do is we really need to do an analysis of the situation individually, because our workplace culture is not going to do it for us. In most cases, our workplace culture is not going to help us here. Not in a modern workplace culture, not in a modern business culture. They don't have time. And so we got to look into this thing, okay? Just the same way we look into how our chairs are positioned or what's our posture, so that we can avoid physical injury. So I'd say, right, this collision, we're using our productive resource to fend off a bunch of junk that interferes with our cognitive resource, right? And so we got to figure out some way to intervene. So I would say, if we can get a good attention management situation going in our lives, okay, that has to do with workflows. It has to do with how you deal with information. It has to deal with how you store things so that you can find them again. All of this, this mature management of information, okay, learning to do the two thumb typing on your mobile is not a scalable approach. Okay, it might be useful in the short term, but it's not scalable, right? So we have to learn how to do this stuff. And what the result we're going to find, in my opinion, okay, is that if we can manage our attention effectively, and we know that we're managing our attention effectively in two ways. One is our stress goes down, our productivity stress goes down, and that frees up attention so that we can apply that attention to productive problems. Productive problem solving is perhaps a better way to say it. Okay, so when we have attention available to do our work, right, then we see that our work gets better. We make fewer errors. So in that sense, it gets faster. Okay. But that's where this technique fits in, right? When we do that, I think that we, like I said, with ergonomics, we can avoid, unnecessarily challenging our brains if we can figure out good, effective techniques for dealing with this stuff. And then ultimately I'll say, cognition is not just about work. Our cognition is about our life as well. We suck up so much cognition while we're, quote, working, that we don't have any left when we get home. Okay, it's hampering relationships. It's hampering, the ability to coach up and train up our children within the home. And it's also then damaging our ability to think about those things, right? If you've been working spreadsheets all day long and you get home and your spouse wants to go over the household finances, you might have used up your spreadsheetingness during the day because you only had a little slice to begin with. So that's where we get to this situation where we can apply good technique, ergonomic technique, to our work. And just because it's cognitive work and not visible doesn't mean that we can get by without taking these steps and dealing with it. Again, if this is something you're interested in, I'm not hard to find. I'd love to talk to you about this and just about your experience. This is a passion for me. I'm trying to heal people here, and the way to do it is with technique. Right. So we started talking about productivity anxiety. And in summary, you know, it's a pervasive problem. So we talked about what the symptoms are. It's this anxiety, it's this constant fear about, did I send the email? Did I miss the meeting? It has huge impact both on our cognition and on our self-perception, which also has impact on our cognition or our ability to do work. Okay. So it's this very tightly wound trap, right? We doubt that we can deal with this, which makes us doubt that we can do good work. And then, anytime we have anxiety, a fundamental problem is that it's using up cognitive resources that could better be applied in different areas and be more productively applied. Anxiety leads to worry, and worry is, a wise person once said, worrying about something is just having the pain of it twice, right? If you worry about some upcoming event that's going to be, challenging, then worrying about it is experiencing that pain now, plus experiencing that pain when you actually face that situation. Okay. The causes, we talked about that. It's this collision of the technology and the culture with our own cognitive abilities and honestly, our neuropsychology, right? I mean, this is at the cellular level that these things happen, and our brains are not equipped to do this. Our brains are wonderful things, right? But we're frittering away that resource by trying to stay on top of, through the cultural mandate of staying on top of all this completely inactionable information. I mean, the modern term is awareness. Society has problem X and we're trying to raise awareness. Well, me being, I'm already aware of many of these situations, so that's out the window, right? So what are you trying to get from me? Well, you're trying to get concern. You're trying to get, some sort of minor action on my part that may or may not help the situation. But largely that information is inactionable. But just because it's inactionable doesn't mean it's not delivered with huge amounts of urgency. And so there we are. That's technology and culture combining to collide with human nature. And as usual, humans, when we face a situation, we apply our tools to it. And that helps us resolve the situation. Okay. So these things are out of alignment. And that's why I say it's an environmental problem, and we all face it. And that's why I say that it's a human nature problem, so we all experience it. Okay, it's very, very common. And it's based on the ratio of inactionable information to actionable information. Another piece is the hustle culture. We talked about that in the workplace. So all of these forces are just combining to put us in this anxiety place. The solution, cognitive ergonomics. So we begin to do our work in ways that helps our cognition rather than fights against it. We begin to deal with these environmental factors that we face all the time. And when we can do that, right, it's through managing our attention. Information has to have our attention in order to be useful. And so we need to figure out better ways to do that. Okay. Now, I would say part of it is some sort of an information diet. But it's not necessary to do that to begin with. What's necessary is to get the best tools and bring them to where you can use them. That's why I developed the attention compass. Again, I felt this pain, okay? And I felt it and dealt with it 12 or 15 years ago. And it wasn't near as bad then as it is now. Twitter was still nice people when I was on it, when it first started up. And now it's this continued urgency. And the tools really are, and I'm talking about social media, they're really designed to take advantage of our psychology in ways that don't benefit us. So, attention management. So, walk through, we diagnosed the pain, the symptoms of productivity anxiety, feelings of inadequacy, the lack of nuanced thinking, the constant feeling of being, choked by information, right? Drinking out of the fire hose is another metaphor that we use. And, there's just so much information. that we literally can't consume. So now we see that this is not a personal failure, but it's a natural outgrowth of culture and technology and their prioritization of speed over strong cognition. I think we can have both. I think strong cognition makes us faster. So I think we can deal with these things more carefully. The bottom line that I want to give you here is the solution is within our control. It's within your grasp. Now we've got to acknowledge that environmental stress has real effects. And these things are well documented in the literature. And it's time for us to recognize the mental repetitive stress injury that the modern workplace can impose on us. I mean, we didn't used to think that the brain could injure itself other than, external physical injury. All right. But now we've got these traumatic stress issues that we're seeing. Okay. We now know that consistent levels of stress produce chemicals that harm our bodies over the long term. Okay. So we begin to understand these things, and that just makes it that much more important that these stress, these environmental factors create this stress, and the stress is damaging to us, both physically and economically. So it's time we took a close look at this, and you and I can do it together. So in my mind, what we need is technique, and I've demonstrated this, I think, in the talk today. It's technique. Okay. We're not trained in this stuff, but we need these principles of attention and cognitive ergonomics. We need to set up our work and our workplaces in such a way that they support our attention and our thinking, because we're thought workers, we're knowledge workers. So these approaches allow us to manage better in this new environment. And we're building systems that work for us, technologies that work for us, rather than constantly feeling like we're struggling to cope, struggling to keep up. So I just want you to recognize that this is important work. Particularly if you're, interested in growing in your career and in flourishing in your life. Strengthening our cognition. And that doesn't mean so much making ourselves smarter as stop making ourselves dumber. So, we all want tips and tricks and that sort of thing, but the work is the work. And the good news is, the system that I teach in 8 weeks, and it's just not that big a deal. We got to prepare, we got to practice, we got to get habits built, and then we'll be less, susceptible to these challenges in the environment. So I would say the pursuit of good attentional ergonomics is a foundation. And once we get that in place, then we can build this strong cognitive workplace. And then we get high performance in life. And fundamentally, this is the way to do busy right. So I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.